Before you hear a word, your brain is already predicting what comes next, often in your own voice, without asking permission. That voice is always there, so constant you forget how strange it is. This internal echo, the voice that speaks without sound, is the primary way many human beings navigate their own existence. If you find value in uncovering these quiet mysteries of the human experience, taking a moment to support this channel allows us to keep exploring together. When you read silently, your brain engages in a complex performance that mimics speech without fully engaging the vocal cords. Scientists refer to this as subvocalization, a process where the muscles in your throat make microscopic, undetectable movements even though no air is passing through them to create sound. This phantom speech is technically known as endophagia, a term derived from Greek roots meaning speech within. It describes the distinct sensation of hearing a voice echoing inside the skull, complete with tone, pacing, and inflection, yet generating zero acoustic vibration in the physical world. It creates a fascinating paradox of human life, for while this experience is nearly universal, it remains the most private aspect of our reality. The interior of the mind is the only truly soundproof room in the universe, where a screaming thought and a whisper hold the exact same volume to the outside observer. For much of recorded history, this was not the norm. Reading was traditionally an oral activity, and ancient libraries were often filled with the murmur of scholars reading aloud to themselves. The shift to silent reading as a default state is a relatively recent development in our cognitive evolution. Because the inner voice is not bound by the mechanical limits of the tongue and lips, it can move significantly faster than spoken language, condensing complex sentences into rapid, abstract bursts. What makes this internal dialogue so compelling is that it feels physically real. Neuroimaging studies reveal that when you talk to yourself in your head, the auditory cortex, the part of the brain responsible for processing actual sound, lights up almost exactly as it does when you hear a person speaking in the room. To your brain, the line between a thought and a heard word is remarkably thin. This hidden conversation serves as the architect of your identity, weaving together the disparate moments of your day into a continuous narrative that you recognize as yourself. Yet, for a surprisingly large number of people, this internal architect operates in total silence. It is a common assumption that the human mind is a noisy place, forever chattering away with sentences and speeches. But recent psychological research suggests that between 30 and 50% of people rarely, if ever, experience a distinct inner voice. This phenomenon, sometimes referred to as anaralia, or the quiet mind, challenges the very definition of what it means to think. If you are someone who narrates your life as it happens, it might seem impossible to imagine a mind without words, a consciousness where the radio is permanently turned off. Yet this silence is the default state for millions of individuals who navigate the world with equal complexity and depth. For those who live in this quiet spectrum, thinking does not take the form of a sentence to be read or heard, but rather arrives as an instant, abstract download of information. This is known as unsymbolized thinking. It is the experience of knowing something without the need to articulate it mentally. When a person with a silent mind realizes they forgot their keys, they do not hear a voice saying, "I forgot my keys." Instead, they simply feel the concept of the keys, the realization of their absence, and the impulse to return, all occurring in a millisecond flash of understanding that involves no language at all. It is a faster, more efficient, yet entirely silent way of processing the world, stripping away the linguistic structure to leave only the raw intent. This variance in internal experience exists on a vast spectrum. On one end lies total silence, often overlapping with anaphasia,
the inability to visualize images, creating a mind that works entirely in concepts and spatial awareness. On the opposite end, we find those with high auditory vividness or hyperphantasia. For these individuals, the inner voice is not just a whisper, but a rich, textured soundscape. They might hear their own thoughts in specific volumes and tones, or play back memories of a loved one's voice with perfect fidelity, distinguishing the exact pitch and cadence as if the person were standing right beside them. Some can even manipulate this internal audio, changing the voice of their inner narrator to sound like a celebrity or a fictional character at will. Much of what we know about this hidden landscape comes from the work of psychologist Russell Hurlburt, who pioneered a method known as descriptive experience sampling. In these studies, participants carried a device that would beep at random intervals throughout the day. At the exact moment of the beep, they were instructed to freeze their mental state and record exactly what was happening inside their minds. The results were startling, as many subjects who believed they had a constant inner monologue were shocked to discover that at the moment of the beep, their minds were actually silent, occupied only by a sensory impression or a feeling. These findings suggest that we often overestimate how much we talk to ourselves, filling in the gaps of our memory with words that were never actually there.
We reconstruct our past moments as narratives, convincing ourselves that we were thinking in sentences, when in reality, we were likely floating in a stream of silent sensory processing. But this silent stream is far from empty. It is simply devoid of subtitles. When psychologists and neuroscientists attempt to categorize the texture of human thought, they find that we do not all inhabit the same internal landscape. While some of us live with a perpetual narrator offering a running commentary on our lives, others exist in a world of pure, abstract concepts or vivid, moving imagery. This distinction is often described as the difference between verbal thinkers and visual thinkers, though most of us sit somewhere on a sliding scale between the two. For a verbal thinker, the concept of an apple usually triggers the word apple echoing in the mind, perhaps followed by a sentence like, "I should buy an apple." For a strong visual thinker, that same concept triggers a flash of red skin, the texture of the stem, or the spatial memory of where apples are located in the local grocery store. History gives us a fascinating glimpse into this non-verbal style through the mind of Albert Einstein. He famously reported that his elements of thought were not words or mathematical signs, but rather visual and muscular images. He described his thinking process as a kind of combinatorial play, where he would move these mental pictures around, associating them in new ways, long before he ever attempted to translate them into language or equations. For Einstein, words were a laborious secondary stage, a translation tool used only to communicate what he had already solved through moving pictures. There is a distinct evolutionary advantage to this visual style: speed. Language is inherently linear and relatively slow. To think in sentences, your brain must adhere to the rules of grammar and the pacing of speech. You can only produce an inner monologue as fast as you can imagine speaking it, which is typically around 150 words per minute. An image, however, is processed in parallel. When you walk into a room, you do not identify the chair, then the table, then the lamp in a sequential list. You perceive the entire scene instantly. Visual thinking allows for this massive, simultaneous processing of information that language simply cannot match. We often experience a strange blending of these styles during the transition to sleep. As the mind begins to relax, the rigid structure of verbal logic starts to unravel.
This period, known as the hypnagogic state, is often characterized by a shift away from linear sentences toward loose associations and fleeting images. You might notice that your internal narrator becomes quieter, replaced by nonsense phrases or sudden vivid scenery, a face, a geometric pattern, or a landscape. This is the brain shifting gears, loosening its grip on the conscious control of language and drifting into the more associative visual realm of dreaming. It suggests that while our waking life is dominated by the need to communicate, our resting mind prefers the efficiency of pictures and feelings. However, for those moments when the voice is clear and distinct, when we are debating a decision or rehearsing a conversation, the experience feels undeniably auditory. We hear the pitch, the timbre, and the intonation as if someone were speaking in the room. This phenomenon forces us to ask a very physical question. If we are hearing words in the silence of our own heads, what part of the brain is actually doing the talking? To find the origin of this phantom speaker, we must turn our attention to the left hemisphere of the human brain, specifically to a small, wrinkled ridge of tissue known as the inferior frontal gyrus. In the annals of medical history, this region is famously called Broca's area, named after the 19th century French physician Paul Broca. Traditionally, neurologists understood this area as the engine of speech production, the control room that choreographs the intricate dance of the tongue, lips, and jaw whenever we vocalize our thoughts to the world. For a long time, it was assumed that this engine went cold the moment we stopped talking. However, modern neuroimaging has dismantled that assumption. When you sit in a quiet room and recite a poem in your head, fMRI scans show that Broca's area lights up with a flurry of electrical activity that is virtually indistinguishable from the activity seen when you read that poem aloud. To the neurons firing in the dark geography of your skull, the difference between a spoken word and a silent thought is negligible. You are initiating the act of speaking, but simply inhibiting the final step of releasing breath and sound. But speech is a two-way street. It requires a listener as well as a speaker. This brings us to the second key player in this silent dialogue, Wernicke's area. Located in the temporal lobe just a short neural distance away, this region is responsible for language comprehension. It is the part of your brain that decodes the meaning of the sentences you hear from others. During inner speech, a fascinating neural loop is established. As Broca's area generates the words, it sends a copy of that information across a bridge of nerve fibers called the arcuate fasciculus directly to Wernicke's area. Essentially, your brain speaks to itself and then immediately listens to what it has to say. This rapid internal game of catch creates the subjective experience of hearing a voice, simulating the sensation of sound without a single vibration hitting the air.
This internal transmission relies on a sophisticated mechanism known as corollary discharge, or an afference copy. When you prepare to think a word, your brain sends a predictive signal to the auditory cortex, effectively warning it of the incoming data. This signal dampens the sensory processing of your own inner voice, distinguishing it from external noises. It is the precise neurological filter that prevents you from confusing your own thoughts with reality, ensuring that the voice feels intimate and self-generated rather than loud or intrusive like a hallucination. It allows you to be both the narrator and the audience simultaneously. Yet this containment is not entirely perfect. The urge to speak is so fundamental to our biology that the signals often leak out of the cerebral cortex.
As Broca's area prepares the words, it frequently sends faint subliminal commands down the brainstem, traveling away from the mind and toward the complex machinery of the vocal tract. These commands arrive at the larynx and tongue, triggering microscopic movements that mirror the words resonating in your mind. This physiological reflex is known as subvocalization, a silent echo of speech that occurs even when your lips remain perfectly sealed. It is the physical manifestation of your inner voice, bridging the gap between abstract thought and the material world. When you recite a grocery list in your head or replay a conversation from yesterday, your brain is not merely processing symbols in a vacuum. It is actively driving the motor cortex to simulate the physical act of speaking. The tongue makes imperceptible adjustments, shifting position to form vowels and consonants that will never be heard. The vocal cords tighten and relax in a ghostly pantomime of sound. You are, quite literally, speaking to yourself with your muscles just below the threshold of breath and vibration. Scientists have verified this invisible performance using electromyography, or EMG, a technique that records the electrical activity produced by skeletal muscles. When researchers place sensitive electrodes on the throat of a person reading silently to themselves, the sensors pick up distinct rhythmic patterns of muscle activation. The correspondence is startlingly precise. If a subject reads a specific word in their head, their vocal apparatus tenses in the exact sequence required to speak that word aloud, simply at a much lower intensity. The body is effectively rehearsing the act of speaking, engaging the machinery without ever flipping the switch to release air. This suggests that for the human body, the difference between thinking a word and saying a word is often just a matter of volume. This biological quirk is so reliable and consistent that it sparked the interest of engineers at the NASA Ames Research Center. They developed technology to harness these faint nerve signals, creating what they call silent speech interfaces. In their experiments, sensors placed on the neck captured the nerve impulses sent to the vocal cords as a subject silently sounded out words. A computer program then decoded these electric whispers and synthesized them into audible speech. Effectively, a person could articulate words in their mind, making no sound whatsoever, yet a machine could voice their thoughts to the world. The implications extend far beyond space travel, hinting at a future where communication does not require the physical movement of air, but simply the intent to speak. Because this link is so deeply forged in our neural pathways, completely eliminating subvocalization is nearly impossible. Many speed reading methodologies claim that silencing this inner narrator is the key to rapid information absorption, arguing that the habit forces your brain to process information at the slow pace of speaking rather than the lightning speed of sight. While it is true that relying heavily on subvocalization can be throttle reading speed, research indicates that suppressing it entirely is not only difficult but potentially detrimental to comprehension. The motor engagement of the throat muscles seems to assist the brain in decoding complex sentence structures and retaining information in short-term memory, acting as a necessary anchor for the wandering mind. The mind clings to the physical sensation of language because it grounds the ethereal nature of thought in something tangible. Yet there is a limit to how fast these muscles can twitch, even microscopically, creating a fascinating friction between the velocity of our cognition and the inertia of our anatomy. That friction becomes most apparent when we look at the raw numbers that govern our communication. When you engage in conversation with a friend, or even when you speak to yourself in an empty room, you are generally capped at a rate of about 125 to 150 words per minute. This is the speed limit of the mouth, governed by the simple physics of how quickly your tongue can touch your teeth and your lips can shape the air. But the mind suffers from no such mechanical drag. Without the need to coordinate breath, vibration, and muscle movement, the inner voice has the potential to accelerate to speeds that would sound like unintelligible noise if they were ever spoken aloud. Researchers studying the density of information transfer in the brain have estimated that inner speech, in its most abstract form, can theoretically burst up to the equivalent of 4,000 words per minute.
This seems impossible if you try to imagine a voice speaking that fast. But that is because your inner narrator often cheats by engaging in a phenomenon known to psychologists as condensed inner speech. When you talk to someone else, you must use full sentences to ensure they understand the context, the subject, and the action. You have to say, "I think I left my red jacket on the chair in the kitchen." But when you are talking to yourself, you already possess the context. You are both the speaker and the listener, so the brain efficiently trims away the fat. You do not need the pronouns, the prepositions, or the descriptive adjectives to understand your own intent. That long sentence about the jacket simply becomes a flash of thought that sounds like jacket kitchen, or perhaps just an image combined with a sense of location. It is a form of cognitive shorthand, a compressed file that unzips instantly into meaning without requiring the time it takes to pronounce every syllable, creating an illusion of velocity where you feel as though you have solved a complex problem in seconds simply because you skipped the linguistic formalities that usually slow you down. I would be curious to know how this sensation manifests for you as you settle down tonight. When you listen to your own internal monologue, does it feel like a calm, paced narration similar to a polished audiobook? Or does it feel more like rapid, abstract bursts of concepts that you barely have to articulate to understand? It is this flexibility that reveals we actually have different gears for our inner voice, often toggling between them without noticing. While that condensed, lightning-fast thought exists, we frequently default to a much slower pace known as expanded inner speech, which mimics our actual speaking voice almost perfectly. Even though your mind could technically process the information faster, the phantom motor signals sent to your vocal cords act as a governor on the engine, restricting your thoughts to the rhythm of your breath. You mentally pronounce the words at roughly the same rhythm you would use to speak them, creating a tempo that feels natural and conversational. It is why when you have a favorite song stuck in your head, it usually plays at the correct tempo rather than speeding up, and why when you read a novel, you can hear the characters speaking at a distinct human pace. The brain artificially slows down its own processing to align with the physical memory of speaking, ensuring that the voice inside feels undeniably human, despite being capable of speeds that far outstrip the body's ability to keep up. This coordination is possible because of a clever neurological trick known as the efference copy. Whenever your brain decides to perform an action, whether that's lifting a coffee cup, blinking your eyes, or articulating a silent sentence, it sends two distinct signals simultaneously. The first signal travels down the neural pathways to the muscles, commanding them to move. The second signal, the efference copy, is a carbon copy of that command sent laterally to the sensory processing areas of the brain. It's essentially a predictive memo, a warning note sent to your senses that says, "I am about to create this specific sensation, so do not be surprised." This mechanism is the precise reason why you cannot tickle yourself. When you reach out to poke your own ribs, your motor cortex sends a blueprint of the movement to your sensory cortex before your fingers even make contact. The brain predicts exactly what the touch will feel like, how much pressure will be applied, and the precise timing of the contact. When the actual sensation arrives a fraction of a second later, it matches the prediction perfectly. Because the brain knows you're doing it to yourself, it categorizes the input as low priority and actively suppresses the feeling.
it cancels out the tickle response. Conversely, when another person touches you, there is no efference copy, no advance warning, and no prediction. The sensation arrives unannounced, triggering a high alert response that results in the overwhelming, chaotic reaction we know as being tickled. This same mechanism of prediction and suppression applies directly to the voice in your head. When you prepare to speak out loud, or even when you engage in silent inner speech, your brain sends an efference copy to the auditory cortex. It effectively tells your hearing center, "I am about to produce language. Do not treat this as an external sound." This dampens the neural response to your own voice, allowing you to intuitively distinguish it from the sounds of the outside world. It acts as a volume knob that automatically turns down self noises while leaving the system sensitive to other noises. This creates the fundamental feeling of agency, the deep intuitive sense that I am the one thinking these thoughts. It is the neurological signature that labels your inner monologue as self rather than other. Without this subtle filtering system, the voice inside your mind would not feel like a private, controlled stream of thought. Instead, it would register with the same sensory impact as a stranger speaking to you. Your own thoughts would sound as loud, intrusive, and startling as a person shouting from across the room, leaving you unable to tell the difference between what you're thinking and what you're hearing. However, this delicate calibration can sometimes falter. Neuroscientists suggest that if the efference copy is disrupted or fails to reach the sensory cortex, the brain produces a thought but fails to predict it.
The thought occurs, but the tag of ownership is missing. To the conscious mind, this internal event feels identical to external input. This biological glitch is currently the leading theory explaining auditory hallucinations. When the prediction mechanism breaks down, a person's own inner voice is no longer recognized as their own and is instead perceived as a distinct, alien entity speaking to them from the outside. To understand the gravity of this glitch, we must appreciate the elegance of the system when it works correctly. In neuroscience, this specific filtering process is known as corollary discharge, or sometimes the afference copy. It acts as a sophisticated neurological predicted text. Every single time your brain sends a motor command to your vocal cords to speak, it splits the signal. One signal goes to the mouth to produce the sound, but a second, identical signal is routed directly to the auditory cortex. This second signal serves as a preemptive warning, effectively telling your hearing centers exactly what sound is about to be produced and instructing them to dampen their sensitivity to that specific frequency. This dampening occurs milliseconds before you even open your mouth. It is the biological reason why you cannot tickle yourself. Your brain anticipates the tactile sensation of your own fingers and cancels out the surprise response. Without this predictive cancellation, your own body would constantly be startling you. The necessity of this auditory filter becomes obvious when we consider the physics of sound. When you speak, you are not just hearing your voice through the air, you are hearing it conducted through the dense bones of your skull. This internal vibration is intense, resonant, and remarkably loud. If your brain did not actively suppress the volume of your own voice, you would effectively desensitize your own ears every time you spoke a sentence. You would be drowning in your own noise, unable to hear the subtle sounds of the environment around you. Evolutionarily, this selective silence is golden. By filtering out self-generated noise, organisms can maintain a high signal-to-noise ratio regarding the outside world. This is a survival mechanism seen throughout the animal kingdom. A cricket chirping for a mate, for instance, must momentarily deafen itself to its own song during the exact moment of the chirp, or it would permanently damage its hearing and never detect the approach of a predator. Humans rely on a more complex version of this same circuit,
It allows us to hold a conversation or think a complex thought while remaining vigilant to external threats. It ensures that the rustle of grass or the snap of a twig takes precedence over the internal hum of our own existence. This dampening effect is so precise that it fundamentally alters how we perceive reality. It explains the nearly universal phenomenon of people disliking the sound of their own voice on a recording. When you speak, you hear a bass-boosted, bone-conducted version of your voice that your brain has actively dampened. When you hear a recording, however, you are hearing the voice as it actually exists in the air, without the bone conduction and without the brain's protective dampening. To you, the recording sounds high-pitched, thin, and alien, but to everyone else, that is simply what you sound like. While this system of self-recognition is robust in adults, it is not entirely innate. It is a learned neurological skill that develops slowly over time. To understand how we learn to distinguish the self from the world, we have to look at the very beginning of the inner voice, observing how children learn to speak, not just to others, but to themselves. This journey of discovery leads us directly to the work of Lev Vygotsky, a Soviet psychologist who revolutionized our understanding of the developing mind in the early 20th century. Before his theories took hold, many researchers believed that when toddlers talked to themselves while playing or solving problems, it was a sign of cognitive immaturity or egocentrism. They viewed it as a failure to recognize that no one else was listening. Vygotsky, however, saw something entirely different and far more profound. He realized that this phenomenon, which is now technically known as private speech, is actually a critical evolutionary bridge between the social world and the individual mind. If you observe a 3-year-old trying to tie their shoes or fit shapes into a puzzle, you will often hear a running commentary. They might say, "Blue one goes here. No, turn it around. Push it down." To a casual observer, it appears they are merely narrating their play, but functionally, they are using language as a physical tool to organize their own behavior. Vygotsky proposed that thought and speech actually begin as separate systems in the infant brain. In the earliest years, speech is purely social, used effectively to get attention or express needs to caregivers. Simultaneously, thought is pre-linguistic, consisting of images, impulses, and sensory associations. The transformation occurs when these two lines of development converge. Around the age of 3, the child discovers that language can be turned inward to regulate their own actions. They begin to issue commands to themselves, mimicking the instructions and guidance they have received from the giants in their world, their parents and teachers. When a caregiver says, "Slow down," or "check the corners," the child absorbs this structure. Later, when working alone, they repeat "slow down" to themselves.
This is not idle chatter. It is the external scaffolding of what will eventually become the internal architecture of their intellect. They are literally talking themselves through the process of thinking. This phase of audible private speech is vital because the young brain is not yet capable of holding complex sequences of instruction in silence. They need to hear the words physically to think the thought conceptually. The sound acts as a cognitive anchor, stabilizing their focus in a distracting physical world. But as the child grows and their neural pathways become more myelinated and efficient, the need for audible volume decreases. The external monologue begins to fragment, abbreviate, and whisper. It allows us to decouple our thoughts from immediate action, creating a vital buffer zone. In the animal kingdom, a stimulus usually leads directly to a response. A rustle in the grass triggers immediate flight. But for humans, the inner voice intercedes. It holds the stimulus in working memory, inspects it, debates the best course of action, and only then releases a response. This simulation engine became particularly crucial in the dense, complex social webs of early human tribes.
Navigating social hierarchies required a delicate touch, and saying the wrong thing to a tribal leader or breaking a taboo could result in exile, which in the ancient world was often a death sentence. The inner voice evolved as a mechanism to rehearse these high-stakes social interactions before they happened. You likely still rely on this ancient software today. Before a difficult conversation or a job interview, you might play out the dialogue, speaking your lines silently and imagining the other person's response. You test the tone, the phrasing, and the timing. If the simulation ends poorly in your head, you discard that draft and write a new one, all before you have even opened your mouth to speak. This executive function extends beyond social maneuvering into the realm of complex problem-solving and self-regulation. When we face a novel or difficult task, our inner speech often ramps up, becoming almost like a coach or a set of verbal instructions. We talk ourselves through the steps, effectively hacking our own attention span. This self-instruction helps organize our behavior over time, holding a specific goal in mind while we attend to the smaller, messy details required to reach it. It allows us to override immediate desires, like the urge to rest or eat, in favor of long-term objectives that exist only as linguistic concepts in the mind. This brings us to the fascinating distinction between human and animal cognition. While we cannot know for certain what the subjective experience of a chimpanzee, a dolphin, or a dog feels like, most cognitive science suggests their thinking is likely based on sensory impressions, images, smells, spatial relationships, and emotional states, rather than a stream of linguistic symbols. A dog may anticipate a walk when it sees a leash, but it likely does not construct a narrative sentence about the walk or debate the merits of the route. Without a structured language to categorize and label the world, the ability to simulate complex, multi-step futures is significantly limited. Animals live largely in the immediate present or the very near future. We, however, can use our inner voice to travel decades forward in time, constructing elaborate life paths that exist nowhere but in our neural circuitry. But to build these future ghosts, the brain needs raw materials. It cannot fabricate a future out of nothing. To construct a believable simulation of what might happen, the mind must scavenge from the only library it has access to: the vast, dusty archives of what has already happened. This retrieval process is often immediate and fleeting, serving a system that psychologists call working memory. Back in the 1970s, researchers Alan Badley and Graham Hitch revolutionized our understanding of this system by realizing that short-term memory isn't just a static box where we store information. Instead, they proposed that it is an active, multi-part workspace, much like a mental workbench. One of the most critical tools on this workbench is specifically designed to handle the voice in your head, a component they named the phonological loop. Think of this loop as a very short, very fragile recording tape that runs on a continuous cycle inside your mind. It acts as a buffer for auditory information, preserving sound-based memories for immediate use. The loop consists of two distinct parts working in tandem. First, there is the phonological store, which acts as an inner ear, holding on to speech-based sounds for just a brief moment. Second, there is the articulatory rehearsal process, which is the scientific name for your inner voice talking to itself. This is the mechanism you use when you try to remember a new phone number or a security code. You look at the digits and repeat them silently. 5925992. By saying the numbers with your inner voice, you are essentially refreshing the recording on the tape before it fades. If you are interrupted, or if you simply stop repeating the sequence, the memory trace decays and disappears in about 2 seconds. That 2-second limit is a defining feature of the human inner voice. It reveals that our working memory is not limited by the number of items we can hold, but by the duration of time it takes to articulate them. This creates a fascinating cognitive quirk known as the word length effect. If you were given a list of 5 short words like sun, bus, pen, cat, and hat, you would likely remember them all with ease because they can be recited quickly. However, if you were given a list of 5 long words like university, opportunity, constitutional, auditorium, and encyclopedia, your recall would plummet. Even though both lists contain exactly 5 items, the second list takes significantly longer to say. Since your phonological loop only has about 2 seconds of tape, the long words simply do not fit on the recording. By the time your inner voice finishes saying encyclopedia, the beginning of the loop has already started to decay, causing the earlier words to drop out of your conscious mind.
This biological constraint of the inner voice creates surprising ripple effects across different cultures. The speed at which you can speak the numbers 1 through 9 in your native language directly predicts how many digits you can hold in your head. In languages like Chinese, the words for numbers are incredibly brief, snapping quickly off the tongue, which allows native speakers to cram more numbers into that 2-second loop. Conversely, in languages where number words are multisyllabic and take longer to pronounce, such as Welsh, the average digit span is shorter. Studies have shown that bilingual speakers will actually remember fewer digits when functioning in a slower language than when they switch to a faster one, simply because the inner voice takes a fraction of a second longer to complete the loop. This reliance on the temporal duration of sound leads us to a fascinating frontier, the mind that has never processed sound at all. For the prelingually deaf, those born without hearing, the concept of an inner voice undergoes a radical transformation, stripping away the auditory shell to reveal the raw machinery of language beneath. If you were born deaf, your internal monologue would not be a sound, but a movement. Research into the deaf experience reveals that the stream of consciousness is often comprised of inner signing. Just as a hearing person might hear the cadence and pitch of a sentence, a deaf person fluent in American Sign Language, or ASL, will mentally see or feel the signs. It is a visual spatial loop rather than a phonological one. When neuroscientists place prelingually deaf participants into fMRI machines and ask them to talk to themselves silently, the auditory cortex, the part of the brain usually lighting up for inner speech in hearing people, remains relatively quiet. Instead, the brain activates the left inferior frontal gyrus along with specific visual motor areas. These are the same regions responsible for planning complex hand movements and tracking visual changes in space. This distinction creates a unique sensory texture to thought. While a hearing person might hear a nagging worry, a deaf person might describe the sensation as a feeling of muscle tension in their hands or arms, even if their body is perfectly still. It is a phantom choreography, a proprioceptive echo, where the brain simulates the physical act of signing without sending the final command to the muscles. This phenomenon is so robust that electromyography, which measures electrical activity in muscles, has detected tiny, imperceptible spikes in the forearms of deaf individuals while they are solving mental problems, mirroring the way the vocal cords of hearing people micro-twitch during silent reading. The nature of this internal simulation is incredibly precise. Errors in inner signing often mirror errors in inner speech. A hearing person might mentally stumble over a tongue twister based on similar sounds, such as "she sells seashells." A deaf person will mentally stumble over finger fumblers, which are signs that require complex or rapidly changing hand shapes. Their constraint on their working memory is not acoustic similarity, but manual dexterity and visual clarity. Perhaps the most striking illustration of this difference is found in how the brain misfires. When a hearing person suffering from schizophrenia experiences hallucinations, they typically report hearing voices. However, researchers have found that deaf individuals with similar conditions often report seeing disembodied hands signing to them in their mind's eye.
This confirms that the voice inside is simply a replay of our primary method of communication. The brain is not biologically hardwired for speech specifically, but for language in whatever form it arrives. This adaptability becomes even more intricate when we look at the brains that manage more than one language, where the inner voice must constantly choose which personality to adopt.
Consider how different languages assign genders to inanimate objects. In German, the word for bridge is feminine, while in Spanish it is masculine. When asked to describe a bridge, German speakers are statistically more likely to use adjectives like beautiful or elegant within their internal assessment, whereas Spanish speakers might instinctively reach for words like strong or sturdy. The voice isn't just reporting on the world, it is actively filtering it through a specific cultural lens, shaping the very texture of the thought before it is ever spoken. It makes one wonder about the architecture of your own thoughts. If you speak more than one language, or even if you are just learning a new one, I am curious to know if you have noticed your inner narrator switching channels depending on your mood or the task at hand. Do you dream in one language and count in another? Feel free to share your experience in the comments, as it is always fascinating to see how different minds organize their internal libraries. Regardless of the language it speaks, there is one characteristic that almost every inner voice shares. It is undeniably fluent. Inside the safety of the mind, we rarely stutter. We do not stumble over pronunciation or search desperately for the next syllable. The inner voice flows with a perfection that our physical vocal cords often fail to match. This creates a profound psychological division for the vast majority of people who stutter. Their internal monologue remains completely unaffected, flowing with a perfect liquid cadence that defies the external struggle. Inside the sanctuary of the mind, the script is read flawlessly, the rhythm is unbroken, and the articulation is sharp. This internal fluency provides compelling evidence that the neural mechanism for generating language is distinct from the mechanism for producing it. The words are fully formed and ready, waiting behind a gate that intermittently refuses to open. If the inner voice were simply a matter of sub-vocalization, essentially tiny silent movements of the tongue and larynx, we would expect the stutter to manifest in our thoughts just as it does in our speech. However, the preservation of a fluid inner monologue suggests that our internal speech exists at a higher level of neural processing. It is a ghost in the machine that knows exactly what it wants to say, even when the mechanical gears of the mouth and throat jam. Researchers have utilized this disconnect to develop the covert repair hypothesis, a theory that offers a fascinating glimpse into the lightning-fast speed at which we process language. It suggests that everyone makes microscopic errors when planning a sentence phonetically, but the average brain unconsciously repairs them milliseconds before they reach the lips. For someone who stutters, this internal error monitoring system appears to be hypervigilant. It detects a minute flaw in the phonetic plan, perhaps a vowel that isn't quite vivid enough, or a consonant transition that feels unstable, and it halts production immediately to fix it. The repetition or block heard on the outside is effectively the brain hitting the backspace key repeatedly at incredible speed, attempting to reconstruct the word perfectly before it is allowed to be spoken. The inner narrator is pushing the word forward, but the internal editor is holding it back, creating a traffic jam at the intersection of thought and sound. This results in a stark duality of existence, where one can be eloquent in silence but struggle in the open air. It forces us to consider how much of our identity is tied to the voice others hear versus the voice we hear ourselves. Have you ever felt that your spoken words failed to capture the complexity of the thought you held in your mind, even without a physical impediment? This universal frustration is magnified intensely for those who stutter, as their internal experience is one of uninterrupted flow, yet the world perceives only the fragmented output.
Neuroimaging studies support this view of a chaotic interface rather than a broken source. Scans often show overactivity in the right hemisphere of the brain during speech for those who stutter, as if the mind is frantically recruiting extra resources to compensate for a timing error in the usual left hemisphere pathways. The broadcast signal is strong, but the wiring creates resistance, proving that the voice inside is separate from the voice outside. This distinction paves the way for understanding another mysterious auditory phenomenon, the phantom narrator that appears whenever we read in silence. When you open a novel, the room remains silent, yet your mind often becomes a stage for a complex auditory performance. This phenomenon goes beyond simple understanding. It is an act of internal ventriloquism, where you spontaneously assign specific timbres, accents, and emotional weights to characters you have never met. If an author describes a villain with a raspy, gravel-filled whisper, your auditory cortex constructs a simulation of that sound, effectively hallucinating a voice that exists nowhere in the physical world. Research suggests that this isn't random. When we read the words of a character we perceive as similar to ourselves, the inner voice often aligns with our own natural speaking cadence.
However, when reading dialogue from a character described as vastly different, perhaps an elderly wizard or a nervous child, the brain recruits neural resources to mimic those distinct vocal traits, creating a rich, multi-voiced tapestry within the silence of the skull. Psychologists refer to this shadow audio track as implicit prosody. It is the reason you can hear the rise and fall of a question, the sharp bite of sarcasm, or the hesitation of a shy confession, all within a stream of flat black text. Implicit prosody handles the musicality of language, the rhythm, stress, and intonation that give words their color. It explains why a poorly constructed sentence feels clunky or jarring even before you analyze the grammar. Your inner ear trips over the rhythm, sensing a discord in the silent flow. This mental ear is so sensitive that if you read a text written in a heavy dialect, your own inner narrator may involuntarily adopt the accent, slowing down to match the phonetics on the page. Nowhere is this phantom voice more essential than in poetry. Unlike prose, which can sometimes be skimmed for information, poetry demands to be sub-vocalized. The line breaks, the white space on the page, and the punctuation are essentially musical notations for the inner voice, dictating exactly where to breathe and how long to hold a silence. To read a poem without hearing it in your head is to strip it of its primary architecture. There are, however, those who view this inner narrator as a bottleneck. Speed reading techniques frequently aim to suppress subvocalization, treating the inner voice as a speed limit. Since the average inner voice speaks at a conversational pace of roughly 150 words per minute, while the eyes can process visual patterns much faster, silencing the ghost allows for rapid data consumption. Yet this efficiency comes at a cost. Studies indicate that while suppressing the inner voice increases speed, it often decreases the retention of complex emotional nuance. You might absorb the plot points, but you lose the texture of the story. The reader's ghost, it seems, is the bridge between mere data and felt experience. This internal narration does more than just animate books. It helps us navigate the world, leading us to the widespread and often misunderstood habit of talking to oneself as a psychological tool. While talking to oneself is a nearly universal habit, the specific words we choose during these private conversations can dramatically alter the brain's response. Most of us default to the first-person pronoun I during these internal monologues. We say, I am overwhelmed, I am anxious, or I don't know what to do. This immersion in the first person acts like a psychological glue, binding the thinker tightly to the emotion at hand. When you use I, you become the storm, indistinguishable from the feeling itself. Psychologist Ethan Kross has dedicated significant research to a subtle linguistic shift that breaks this bond.
He discovered that simply changing the pronoun from I to you, or even using one's own name, triggers a powerful phenomenon known as self-distancing. It sounds incredibly simple, almost too trivial to be effective, yet the neurological impact is profound. When a person speaks internally using their own name, thinking, for example, "Why are you worried about this?" rather than "Why am I worried?" the brain shifts gears. It moves activity away from the emotional processing centers that trigger the fight or flight response and engages the prefrontal cortex, the area responsible for logic, planning, and reasoning. By speaking to yourself as if you were another person, you are essentially tricking your mind into adopting an objective perspective. It is the difference between being trapped in the chaotic traffic of a city street and viewing that same city from an airplane window. The distance provides clarity without reducing the importance of the situation. This connects deeply to a concept scientists call the Solomon paradox. King Solomon was historically renowned for his wisdom in guiding others, offering sage advice to subjects and kings alike, yet his own personal life was often a series of disastrous decisions. He could not access his own wisdom because he was too close to the picture. We suffer from this same paradox. We often give excellent, rational, and compassionate advice to a friend in crisis, seeing their situation with a clarity they cannot possess. However, when we face the exact same crisis, we often crumble under the weight of emotional immersion. We lose our way because the I perspective clouds our judgment. Using the second or third person allows us to access the wisdom we usually reserve for others. It turns the internal critic into an internal coach, effectively bypassing the ego's defensive mechanisms. Studies utilizing this technique show measurable physical results. People who utilize this self-distancing method before a high-pressure event, like a public speech or a difficult negotiation, experience significantly lower blood pressure and heart rate variability compared to those who psych themselves up using I. They report less shame, less rumination, and they perform objectively better. It creates a necessary buffer zone, a momentary step back from the heat of the immediate experience, transforming a threat into a manageable challenge. But the words themselves are only half the equation. Just as the pronoun shifts the perspective, the specific emotional quality of that internal voice, the texture, the volume, and the perceived kindness or cruelty of the tone plays an equally critical role in how the message is received. To understand why this internal tone often tilts toward the harsh or the critical, we must look backward into our evolutionary history. The human brain was not primarily designed for happiness, it was designed for survival. For our ancestors roaming the savannah, overlooking a patch of sweet berries was merely a missed opportunity, but overlooking the rustle of a predator in the tall grass was fatal. Consequently, the human mind evolved a sticky, Velcro-like quality for negative information and a Teflon-like quality for positive experiences, a phenomenon psychologists call the negativity bias. This ancient survival mechanism subtly hijacks our inner speech. The voice inside tends to flag errors, highlight potential dangers, and replay social missteps with high fidelity, believing it is keeping us safe by keeping us vigilant. However, there is a profound distinction between constructive rehearsal and destructive rumination. Constructive inner speech functions like a coach. It identifies a specific error, perhaps a forgotten name or a clumsy phrase, and strategizes a correction for next time. It focuses on the behavior. Destructive criticism, the kind that keeps people awake at night, attacks the core of the self. It shifts from "I made a mistake" to "I am a mistake." In the realm of cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, these intrusive critical bursts are known as automatic negative thoughts, or ANTs. These thoughts are reflexive, popping into consciousness without invitation, often triggered by stress or fatigue. They are not necessarily true, yet because they arise from within our own minds, they carry an implicit weight of authority that makes them difficult to dismiss. One might wonder where this specific vocal character comes from.
If the inner voice is ours, why does it sometimes sound like a stranger, or worse, an adversary? Developmental psychologists suggest that our internal dialogue is often a sedimented history of the external voices we heard most frequently during childhood. The tone of a strict parent, a demanding teacher, or a critical peer does not simply vanish when we grow up, it is internalized. We absorb their cadence, their vocabulary, and the level of patience. If a child is constantly told they're clumsy, their adult inner voice is likely to snap, "Watch out," the moment they stumble. We essentially learn to talk to ourselves the way we were talked to. Recognizing that this voice is often a mimicry of the past, rather than an accurate reporter of the present, is the first step in changing the conversation. This shift is crucial because the implications of that voice extend far beyond mood. The conversation we have in our heads has the power to alter our physical reality, influencing everything from heart rate to muscle tension, acting as a direct control panel for human performance. Nowhere is this biological link more evident than in the arena of high-performance sports, where the margin between victory and defeat is measured in millimeters or milliseconds. Athletes have long understood that the voice in their head is not merely a commentator observing the game from the sidelines, but an active participant playing it on the field. Psychopsychologists have spent decades dissecting this phenomenon, eventually categorizing our internal dialogue into two distinct frequencies: motivational self-talk and instructional self-talk. While we might assume that the loud internal shouting of "you can do this" is the most effective fuel for a competitor, the data suggests a far more nuanced reality, depending on the task at hand. Motivational self-talk serves a clear purpose. It is the engine of psyching up, increasing raw effort, and maintaining drive when the emotional tank runs dry. But instructional self-talk, the specific technical cues we mutter to ourselves regarding form and strategy, often holds the key to precision. Consider a weightlifter approaching a heavy snatch. Internally screaming, "Be strong," might help with raw power output, but silently repeating specific cues like "elbows high" or "drop fast" engages the motor cortex in a way that sharpens the actual execution of the movement. Studies involving basketball players shooting free throws and golfers attempting delicate putts have consistently shown that for tasks requiring fine motor skills and accuracy, telling yourself exactly how to move is vastly superior to simply cheering yourself on. The voice acts as a guidance system, focusing attention on the mechanics and crowding out distractions. This internal coaching does something even more profound when we look at endurance sports. It effectively hacks the body's perceived limits. There's a concept in exercise physiology known as the central governor theory, which suggests that physical fatigue is not just a mechanical failure of the muscles, but a protective emotion generated by the brain to prevent catastrophic damage. Your legs aren't actually unable to take another step. Your brain is just inducing the sensation of exhaustion to force you to stop before you hurt yourself. The inner voice is one of the few tools capable of overriding this safety switch. By consciously changing the narrative from "I am hurting" to "keep the cadence smooth," an athlete effectively renegotiates with their own nervous system, unlocking reserves of energy that the brain was hoarding for safety. The impact reaches down to the molecular level. Research measuring salivary cortisol, the body's primary stress hormone, has found that athletes who practice positive, structured self-talk show significantly lower physiological stress markers during competition than those who let their minds wander. The voice essentially acts as a biochemical regulator, keeping the autonomic nervous system in a state of controlled flow rather than fight or flight panic. It turns the terrifying uncertainty of high-stakes competition into a manageable series of instructions, proving that words spoken silently can dictate the chemistry of the blood. However, this powerful tool is double-edged. While a disciplined voice can push a body to impossible heights, an undisciplined one can dismantle it just as quickly. The same mechanism that allows a runner to ignore pain can also lock a person into a cycle of worry.
When the instructional cues turn into criticism and the motivational speeches turn into doubt, the control panel malfunctions. We move from a state of flow to a state of fixation, where the voice stops moving us forward and instead begins to spin in circles, trapping us in the sticky, repetitive loop where the dialogue gets stuck. This specific form of mental friction is what psychologists call rumination. Derived from the Latin word for chewing cud, it describes a mind that isn't digesting information, but rather regurgitating it. It is the neurological equivalent of a scratched vinyl record, where the needle hits a flaw in the groove and bounces back to the same chord over and over again. Unlike productive problem-solving, which moves linearly toward a resolution, rumination is circular. It is a closed loop. The brain, in a misguided attempt to protect you, fixates on a past error or a future worry, operating under the false belief that if it just replays the scene one more time, it might spot a detail it missed or find a way to retroactively change the outcome. But the outcome never changes, only the groove gets deeper. What makes this loop so difficult to break is the physical nature of thought itself. We often speak of habits of behavior, like biting your nails or checking your phone, but we rarely discuss habits of thought. Yet the biological mechanism is exactly the same. Every time you traverse a specific neural pathway, every time you replay that awkward conversation from years ago, you are reinforcing the synaptic connection associated with it. You are physically thickening the insulation around that wiring, speeding up the transmission for next time. This follows the Hebbian principle that neurons that fire together wire together. By dwelling on a negative thought, you are effectively digging a trench in your own mind, making it the path of least resistance for your inner voice to slide into the moment your attention wavers. The more you revisit the memory, the deeper the groove becomes, and the harder it requires the needle to work to jump the track. This is why it is so crucial to distinguish rumination from reflection, as they can feel deceptively similar on the surface. Reflection is an active, exploratory process that usually leads to a conclusion. It asks, "What can I learn from this?" and then files the memory away, reducing the emotional charge. Rumination is passive and stagnant. It tends to ask unanswerable questions like, "Why is this happening to me?" or "What if everything goes wrong?" without ever intending to find a concrete answer. This difference often explains why the inner voice seems to become loudest and most critical precisely when the lights go out. During the day, the sensory demands of the world act as a buffer. Traffic, work, conversations, and screens demand our cognitive resources, leaving little processing power for the inner critic to hijack the system. But when we lie down in the dark, the external inputs vanish. The silence acts as a vacuum. In the absence of immediate tasks, the brain switches into what neuroscientists call the default mode network. This is the neurological seat of the self. It is the home of your autobiography. When this network is active, you are not processing the temperature of the room or the color of the wall. You are processing you. This is the physiological machinery that allows you to engage in mental time travel. It retrieves memories from the past, reshapes them, and projects them into the future to simulate hypothetical scenarios. This is why, when you are bored, you rarely stay in the present moment. Your mind naturally drifts to a conversation you had yesterday or rehearses an argument you might have tomorrow. The narrator in your head is the voice of this network, constantly weaving a coherent story out of your disparate experiences to give you a sense of identity. Interestingly, this system functions on a biological seesaw with the brain's attention networks. They are anti-correlated, meaning when one goes up, the other must go down.
This explains why losing yourself in a demanding external task feels so relieving. If you are rock climbing, painting intricate details, or analyzing a complex spreadsheet, the brain must allocate its resources to the task-positive network. To do this, it actively suppresses the default mode network. The chatter of the autobiographical self creates too much noise for high-performance focus, so the brain mutes the narrator. This is the neuroscience behind the state of flow, where you become so absorbed in an activity that you forget yourself, your worries, and even the passage of time. The voice falls silent because the energy powering it has been diverted elsewhere. However, the wandering mind does not always speak in words. The inner experience is not strictly limited to sentences, arguments, and monologues. For many, the silence is filled not by a narrator, but by a melody. As we explore the auditory texture of the mind, we must look at what happens when the inner voice stops speaking and starts singing. This phenomenon leads us to one of the most universal and persistent quirks of human cognition, the earworm. This phenomenon, formerly known as involuntary musical imagery, is vividly captured by the German term Ohrwurm. Translated literally as earworm, the word originally referred to the earwig, an insect once mythically feared to crawl into the human ear. While the musical variety is physically harmless, it burrows just as deeply into the neural pathways. There is a specific psychological mechanism behind why your inner voice suddenly decides to abandon conversation and instead loop a single chorus of a pop song from decades ago. It is essentially a cognitive itch that the brain is struggling to scratch. This repetitive looping is often attributed to a principle called the zygotic effect. In the 1920s, psychologist Bluma Zygotic observed that waiters in a cafe could remember complex orders perfectly as long as the bill remained unpaid. However, the moment the transaction was complete, the memory vanished entirely. The human brain creates a tension around incomplete tasks, keeping them active in working memory until they are resolved. When you hear a catchy snippet of a song but do not hear the end, your brain flags it as an open loop. It repeats the fragment over and over, unconsciously attempting to find the resolution or the final chord that will allow it to close the mental file. This is why listening to the entire song from start to finish is often the only way to banish the melody. You are giving your brain the closure it craves. You may have noticed that it is almost always the chorus rather than the verse that gets stuck. The inner voice prefers simplicity and rhythmic repetition. Choruses are engineered to be predictable, making them easy for the auditory cortex to reconstruct without effort. Interestingly, this musical loop occupies the same specific bandwidth in your brain as your internal monologue. This system is called the phonological loop. Because the inner ear and the inner voice share this short-term memory storage, it becomes very difficult to read a book or do mental arithmetic while a song is playing in your head. The cognitive slot is simply already full. Studies indicate this is a nearly universal human quirk, with approximately 98% of the population reporting that they experience stuck songs. It happens more frequently when we are tired, stressed, or bored, states where our cognitive defenses are lowered, allowing the brain's autopilot to take over. If you ever find yourself trapped in such a loop, researchers have discovered a surprisingly physical solution. Chewing gum can disrupt the cycle. Because the inner voice involves microscopic movements of the jaw and tongue muscles, a process known as subvocalization, the physical act of chewing interferes with the motor program required to sing the song in your head. Engaging the brain with a moderately difficult puzzle like an anagram achieves a similar result by forcing the working memory to switch tracks. But the mind's tendency to replay sensory inputs is not limited to sound. Just as the auditory cortex can get stuck on a melody, the visual cortex can become fixated on a pattern. This leads us from the phantom sounds of the inner ear to the lingering images of the mind's eye. This phenomenon is most famously recorded in the annals of pop psychology,
as the Tetris effect. It was termed in the mid-90s after avid players of the block-stacking puzzle game reported that long after they had put the controller down, they could still see the falling geometric shapes. When they closed their eyes to sleep, the blocks continued to tumble and rotate in the darkness of their mind's eye, a phantom overlay that seemed impossible to turn off. But this experience is not unique to gamers. It's a fundamental quirk of how human perception handles repetitive data. If you spend an entire afternoon weeding a garden, you may find that as you drift off, your visual field is filled with the vivid green shapes of dandelions and clover. If you spend hours on a boat, you might feel the phantom sensation of waves rocking you, known as mal de débarquement, which is the vestibular system's version of the same loop.
Researchers at Harvard Medical School discovered that this imprint is incredibly deep, residing in a part of the brain distinct from conscious memory. They studied patients with amnesia who could not form new declarative memories. After playing Tetris, these patients had no recollection of the game itself. They did not know they had played it, yet just before sleep, they reported seeing floating blocks. This suggests that the inner experience of these patterns is a form of procedural learning, where the brain optimizes its pattern recognition systems offline. While this is primarily a visual or sensory echo, your inner voice often gets involved in the simulation, transforming from a storyteller into a strategic coach. As the phantom blocks fall or the imaginary weeds appear, the inner voice might continue to solve the problem, quietly calculating where to place a piece or scanning for the next route to pull. It creates a blend of visual hallucination and internal commentary, a state where you are technically resting, but a background process is furiously working to consolidate the skills you use during the day. This is remarkably similar to what happens in the brains of rats. Studies have shown that when rats sleep after running a maze, their neurons fire in the exact same sequence as they did in the maze, literally thinking through the path again in fast forward. It makes me wonder if your brain has a favorite loop that visits you after a long day. I'm curious, have you ever spent a day doing a task so repetitive, like sorting files, knitting, coding, or driving, that it continued to play out behind your closed eyes when you finally went to bed? I would love to read about your personal version of the Tetris effect in the comments. This repetitive echo marks the entry point into the hypnagogic state, that heavy, fluid borderland between being fully awake and falling asleep. Here, the rigid structure of the Tetris blocks begins to melt, and the logic of the waking world dissolves. The inner voice, which has been so logical and articulate all day, starts to lose its grip on syntax and structure. As the brain waves slow down, the internal monologue stops speaking in full sentences and begins to deal in impressions, abstract associations, and nonsensical phrases that vanish as soon as you try to inspect them. This transitional state is known as hypnagogia, a term derived from the Greek words for sleep and leading, representing the bridge your consciousness crosses every night. Here, the strict editor in your head, the one that usually ensures your internal sentences have subjects, predicates, and logical consistency, finally clocks out for the evening. What remains is a stream of consciousness in its purest, most chaotic form. You might hear your inner voice pronounce a phrase with absolute authority, something that feels like the ultimate solution to a problem you have been worrying about for weeks. The emotional weight of the thought is heavy and profound, convincing you that you have stumbled upon a moment of genius. Yet, if you were to jolt awake and write the words down, they might read as something completely bizarre, like "the blue umbrella solves the equation." This disconnect happens because the regions of your brain responsible for logic and reality testing go offline slightly before the regions responsible for generating language and emotion.
You're left with the feeling of insight without the architecture of sense. It's a fascinating betrayal of the mind, where the inner voice becomes a surrealist poet rather than a reliable narrator. As you drift deeper, the sense of ownership over this voice begins to dissolve. During the day, you usually feel like the author of your thoughts, deliberately constructing arguments or planning your schedule. In the hypnagogic state, however, you become a passive observer. The thoughts are no longer things you create, they are things that happen to you. They bloom spontaneously, often triggered by loose associations or sensory echoes from the day. This phenomenon is closely related to what psychologists call the Tetris effect. If you have spent hours performing a repetitive task, like playing a video game, coding, or weeding a garden, your inner voice may loop fragments of that activity, narrating the movements or replaying the sounds. It's the brain's way of sorting and filing away the day's experiences, and your internal monologue becomes the audible side effect of that filing process. Sometimes this voice shifts from being a silent thought to something that sounds almost audible, bordering on a hallucination. You might hear your name called or a snippet of a conversation, distinct and clear, as if someone is standing in the room. This can be startling, jarring you back to wakefulness, but it's a completely normal part of the brain's shutdown sequence. It signals that the sensory gates are closing and the internal world is becoming more vivid than the external one. It's a surrender of control. You are no longer steering the ship, you're drifting on the current. This loss of voluntary control over the inner voice is actually a necessary step towards unconsciousness. You can't force yourself to sleep. You can only create the conditions for sleep to take you. In the same way, you can't force these nonsensical thoughts to make sense. You must simply let them flow. But this transition exposes a strange ambiguity about the nature of the mind.
If the voice continues to speak even when you are not consciously directing it, generating words and ideas that you did not choose, it invites a lingering curiosity about who is really in charge during the waking hours. Consider the distinct sensation that thoughts simply arrive in your mind, appearing fully formed like guests entering a room unannounced. While we instinctively claim ownership over these words, treating them as our own deliberate creations, the actual mechanics of thought production suggest a different reality. Philosophers and meditation practitioners have long observed that you do not consciously choose your next thought before you think it, because to do so, you would have to think it before you thought it, creating an infinite regression. Instead, thoughts may be better understood as events that happen to you rather than actions you perform, a concept that fundamentally shifts the role of the inner voice from a speaker to a reporter. Modern neuroscience supports this counterintuitive view with evidence regarding the timing of volition. Neural imaging studies have repeatedly demonstrated that neural activity indicating a decision, such as moving a finger or choosing a word, occurs hundreds of milliseconds and sometimes several seconds before the conscious mind feels like it has made a choice. By the time you hear the inner voice articulate a decision, the brain has already executed the necessary calculations in the dark silence of the unconscious. The voice acts less like a captain steering the ship and more like a navigator reading the map after the turn has already been made, claiming credit for a direction chosen by deep, inaccessible neural networks. This phenomenon is most clearly explained by the concept of the interpreter module, a term coined by cognitive neuroscientist Michael Gazzaniga. Located primarily in the left hemisphere of the brain, this system is tasked with creating a coherent narrative out of the chaotic and disparate signals arising from the body and mind. When the brain acts on impulse or instinct, the interpreter instantly fabricates a logical explanation to make sense of the action, weaving it into the ongoing story of the self.
In famous studies involving split brain patients, this module was observed confidently inventing false reasons for behaviors initiated by the disconnected right hemisphere, completely unaware that it was confabulating. It reveals that the inner voice is a tireless storyteller, obsessed with cause and effect, stitching together the fragmented moments of existence into a seamless illusion of continuity. It creates the sensation of a singular, unified I that persists through time, even though the underlying machinery is a collection of competing drives and automated processes. This gap between the feeling of authorship and the reality of automatic generation might explain why the voice can sometimes feel alien or intrusive, nagging us with worries we did not ask for. Before we understood this biological narrative engine, humanity had to find other ways to explain the voice that spoke without being spoken to. In the ancient world, the lack of an apparent internal author led to a very different conclusion about where these words came from. In the mid-20th century, a Princeton psychologist named Julian Jaynes presented one of the most radical theories in the history of psychology to answer that very question. He proposed the hypothesis of the bicameral mind. This theory suggests that as recently as 3,000 years ago, human beings were not conscious in the way we understand the term today. Instead, the human mind was divided into two distinct chambers that operated without the bridge of introspection. In this ancient mental architecture, the brain's right hemisphere would generate auditory instructions that were perceived not as internal thoughts, but as external commands, while the left hemisphere simply obeyed them. When an ancient person faced a crisis, a moment of stress, or a novel situation where habit failed, they did not pause to deliberate or ask themselves what they should do. They did not look inward. Instead, they hallucinated a voice. To the person hearing it, this voice sounded completely distinct, authoritative, and often divine. Jaynes argued that what we now recognize as the inner monologue was once experienced as the direct speech of kings, ancestors, or gods. This would mean that early civilizations were built by people who walked through the world in a trance-like state of volition, guided by auditory hallucinations that kept society functioning. To support this startling idea, Jaynes pointed to the earliest surviving literature, specifically the Iliad of Homer. When analyzed through a specific linguistic lens, the characters in this epic poem display a curious lack of inner life. They do not plan, they do not wonder, and they do not reflect. In the original text, there are no words that directly translate to consciousness, mind, or even deciding. When the hero, Achilles, pauses from striking down a foe, it is not because he has considered the moral weight of his actions or debated the pros and cons in his head, but because the goddess Athena physically grabs his hair and tells him to stop. The causation of behavior was perceived entirely external. Emotions were not psychological states, but physical surges sent by the divine. However, this mental structure could not last forever. Jaynes suggested that the bicameral mind began to break down during the chaotic Bronze Age collapse.
As civilizations grew more complex, encountered strangers with different customs, and developed writing, the simple commands of the bicameral voices became contradictory or insufficient. The stress of this complexity forced a cognitive shift. The voices of the gods fell silent, leaving humanity in a terrifying quiet. To survive, we had to invent a new way to navigate the world. We developed a metaphorical inner space, a theater of the mind, where we could hold a dialogue with ourselves, simulating the voices that used to come from the heavens. We internalized the God voice, turning it into the I that narrates our lives today. While this theory remains controversial, it suggests that our inner voice is not just a biological factory setting, but a cultural artifact. And if the voice is cultural, it stands to reason that it might sound very different depending on where you were born. When researchers place these different cultural frameworks side by side, they find that the landscape of the mind shifts just as dramatically as the geography of the Earth. In societies that sociologists classify as individualistic, primarily in North America and Western Europe, the inner voice tends to function like a solitary captain steering a ship. Studies suggest that Western self-talk is heavily saturated with the pronoun I, focusing intensely on personal agency, individual desires, and self-affirmation. The internal narrator in a Western mind is often busy bolstering self-esteem or rehearsing arguments where the self is the protagonist, constantly narrating a story of personal triumph or individual struggle against the world. However, when psychologists examine the inner lives of people from collectivist cultures, such as those in East Asia, the inner monologue undergoes a fascinating transformation. The voice becomes less of a soloist and more of a chorus member. Research indicates that in these cultures, inner speech is frequently less focused on self-promotion and more attuned to social roles and relationships. Instead of asking, "What do I want?" the inner voice might be more likely to ask, "How do I fit into this situation?" or "How are my actions affecting the group?" This reflects the Vygotskian idea that our inner voice is just internalized social speech. If your society values harmony and group cohesion over individual distinction, the voice inside your head will adopt that same priority, serving as a check on your behavior rather than a cheerleader for your ego. This cultural divergence even changes the visual perspective of our internal thoughts. When Westerners replay a memory in their mind's eye to narrate it to themselves, they almost strictly see it from the field perspective, looking out through their own eyes, seeing their hands and the world in front of them. Conversely, studies show that people from Eastern cultures are far more likely to utilize an observer perspective, seeing the memory from a third-person angle, as if watching themselves from the outside. This mental shift changes the narration from a subjective, visceral experience to a more objective, social evaluation of how they appeared to others in that moment. There is also the question of silence. In many Western traditions, silence is often viewed as a void to be filled, which may explain why Westerners report a high frequency of chatter, a constant stream of verbal thought to validate existence. In contrast, many Eastern philosophical traditions view silence as a state of fullness and wisdom. Consequently, some cross-cultural studies suggest that individuals in East Asia may experience periods of inner silence more comfortably, or simply rely less on verbal sentences to process their thoughts, thinking instead in images or abstract feelings. Yet whether the voice speaks in the singular I of the West or the relational context of the East, it remains our primary tool for not just understanding the past, but for constructing the future. This ability to simulate reality before it happens is perhaps the most powerful function of the voice, leading us directly into the realm of human creativity. When we turn this simulation engine towards the specific craft of storytelling, the results can be startlingly autonomous. For centuries, novelists and playwrights have reported a peculiar phenomenon where the characters they create seem to wake up, look around, and start talking back. This is not merely a figure of speech or a romanticized view of the artistic process, but a distinct psychological experience that researchers have formally labeled the illusion of independent agency. In surveys of fiction writers, nearly 60% report hearing their characters' voices as distinct from their own everyday inner monologue. These fictional beings often argue with their creators, refuse to follow the plot outline the author has meticulously planned, or make jokes that the author feels they did not consciously invent. It's as if the brain spins up a separate simulation of a person so complete that it runs a subroutine of consciousness alongside the writer's own. The author asks a question, and the character answers immediately,
often with a specific accent, cadence, or vocabulary that the author implies they're simply listening to rather than actively constructing. Crucially, psychological research differentiates this experience from hallucination or psychosis. Writers who experience this independent agency almost always retain executive control and understand clearly that the voice originates from within their own minds.
It is a controlled, voluntary form of dissociation, a professional harnessing of the brain's predictive machinery. When you read a novel and the dialogue feels incredibly snappy, organic, and real, it is often because the writer was not forcing the words onto the page, but simply transcribing what this internal simulation was saying in real time. This mechanism appears to be a sophisticated adult continuation of the imaginary friends many of us engaged with as children. The cognitive architecture required to sustain an invisible companion, giving them a stable personality, predicting their reactions to new situations, and hearing their voice in your head, is the same architecture that allows an author to write a believable argument between two fictional people. The brain is practicing social dynamics in a safe sandbox environment. It is the ultimate expression of the inner voice as a simulator, capable of running multiple distinct personalities simultaneously to see how they interact, effectively turning the skull into a theater where the inner voice splits into a cast of actors. Historically, before we understood neuroscience, this experience of receiving dictation from a voice that felt separate from the self was often attributed to the muses or divine spirits. It felt like a gift from the outside because the processing happened in the subconscious, delivering the final sentence to the conscious mind fully formed. But while this creative cacophony is a gift for the storyteller, the relentless nature of our internal narration can sometimes become a burden. The capacity to generate speech is so robust and so automatic that the silence we often crave becomes elusive, leaving us wondering if there is an off switch to the stream of words. While a permanent off switch remains elusive for most, the human mind possesses a remarkable ability to change its relationship with that stream, a capability scientifically known as metacognition. Simply put, this is the ability to think about your own thinking. It represents a fundamental shift in consciousness, moving from being the protagonist caught in the drama of the inner monologue to becoming the audience member watching the screen. When you are fully engrossed in a train of thought, perhaps rehearsing a future argument or reliving a past mistake, you are merged with the voice. In that state, there is no separation. The thought feels like absolute reality. Metacognition introduces a gap. It is the moment you suddenly realize, I am thinking about dinner, or I am worrying about tomorrow. In that split second of recognition, the voice loses its absolute authority because you have stepped outside of it to look at it. This psychological pivot is the engine behind mindfulness practices. The goal is not necessarily to force the voice into silence, which is a biological function of the brain that is difficult to arrest, but to alter your position relative to it. Teachers of this practice often describe the mind as a crashing waterfall. In our default state, we stand directly beneath the cascade of water of our thoughts, getting soaked by every worry, plan, and judgment. The practice of the observer does not require stopping the water. It simply asks you to step out of the current and stand on the rocky bank behind the waterfall. From this vantage point, the water continues to fall with the same intensity, but you are no longer being hit by it. You are watching the flow rather than drowning in it. This shift from participant to observer is not merely a philosophical concept or mental trick. It leaves a physical footprint in the neurology of the brain. Neuroimaging studies reveal that engaging the observer self dampens the activity of the default mode network, the brain circuit responsible for mind-wandering and self-referential narratives.
Furthermore, consistent practice actually increases the cortical thickness in the prefrontal cortex, the center of executive control, and changes its connectivity with the insula and the amygdala. The insula is a region deeply involved in interoception, sensing the internal state of the body. When we strengthen these neural pathways, we gain the ability to notice a stressful thought, a sentence spoken by the inner voice, without immediately triggering the body's fight or flight response. We create a momentary pause between the internal sentence and the emotional reaction. This pause is where a distinct sense of tranquility can be found, even if the voice is still chatting away in the background. It changes the texture of the mind from a chaotic newsroom to a passing stream. It invites a rare kind of internal stillness that is less about empty silence and more about non-reactivity. When the internal chatter momentarily subsides or loses its grip, do you find that sudden quietness peaceful, or does it feel unsettling to be alone without the narrator? Learning to sit comfortably with the observer, watching the thoughts drift by like clouds without chasing them, is often the final frontier in understanding the voice in our heads. It reveals that we are not the voice itself, but the vast silent awareness in which the voice arises and eventually fades away. Yet this profound silence is not exclusive to deep meditation or the moments just before sleep. Sometimes the inner narrator is silenced not by stillness, but by intense, focused action. Psychologists and neuroscientists refer to this optimal state of consciousness as flow, often colloquially described as being in the zone.
When you are deeply engaged in a task, whether it is writing, coding, playing an instrument, or participating in high-speed sports, the brain shifts its processing strategy in a way that effectively unplugs the microphone of the inner voice. This phenomenon is explained by a concept known as transient hypofrontality. The term might sound complex, but its components reveal a simple truth about how our minds prioritize resources. Transient means temporary. Hypo is the Greek root for less or under, and frontality refers to the prefrontal cortex. Essentially, to enter a flow state, the brain must temporarily downregulate or lower the activity of the prefrontal cortex. This is significant because the prefrontal cortex is the seat of higher executive function. It is where we analyze, plan, worry, and most importantly, where we monitor ourselves. The inner critic, that nagging voice asking if you are doing it right or wondering what you look like while you work, resides largely in this area of the brain. The prefrontal cortex is incredibly energy expensive. It requires a vast amount of metabolic fuel to keep that self-reflective commentary running. When a challenge arises that demands your absolute attention, where your skill level perfectly matches the difficulty of the task, the brain makes an executive decision to conserve energy. It shuts down the non-essential systems to focus entirely on the present moment. Since self-monitoring is considered a luxury during high-stakes performance, the part of the brain responsible for generating the inner voice simply goes offline. This is why people in a state of flow often report a loss of self-consciousness. The I that usually chatters away disappears, leaving only the action itself. A pianist playing a complex concerto isn't thinking, "I am moving my fingers now." The music is simply happening through them. Alongside this silence comes the distortion of time, another function of the prefrontal cortex. When that area quiets down, the brain's ability to track the passage of time falters, creating the sensation that hours have passed in minutes or that a split-second moment has stretched into an eternity. The silence of the flow state suggests that our constant internal narration is not a fundamental necessity of consciousness, but rather a specific tool used for navigation and social prediction. When the need to predict the future or analyze the past is removed by the urgency of the present, the voice recedes. It implies that the self,
That conversational identity we fiercely protect is arguably a biological function that can be toggled on and off like a light switch. This biological mechanism aligns startlingly well with ancient philosophical views on the nature of the self and the void. In the ancient traditions of the East, specifically within Buddhist philosophy, this realization is encapsulated in the doctrine of anatman, or the concept of no self. The central insight here is that what we perceive as a solid, unchanging identity, the I that wakes up in the morning and goes to sleep at night, is actually a fluid, ever-changing process rather than a permanent object. The inner voice is the primary architect of this illusion. It acts as a relentless storyteller, stitching together disparate memories, sensory inputs, and future projections into a seamless narrative. It convinces you that there is a constant character at the center of the drama, much like a movie projector moving film so quickly that individual frames blur into a continuous motion. But just as the movie is an optical illusion created by speed, the self is a psychological illusion created by the rapid succession of thoughts. This philosophical stance finds a striking parallel in modern neuroscience. For decades, researchers searched for the biological seat of the self, a specific region in the brain where all sensory information converges and where decisions are made. They were looking for a homunculus, a theoretical little pilot inside your head who watches the world through your eyes and pulls the levers of your behavior. However, brain imaging technology has revealed that no such center exists. There is no single commander. Instead, the brain operates as a decentralized network of parallel processes. The sense of being a unified I is an emergent property, a phenomenon that arises from the complex interaction of millions of neurons firing in the default mode network and other circuits. The voice you hear is not the pilot. It is simply a report generated by the system, a readout of neural activity that we mistake for the source of that activity. Understanding that the inner voice is a biological construct rather than the essence of your soul offers a profound sense of liberation. It changes the power dynamic entirely. If the voice is just a mechanism, then its contents are not necessarily absolute truths about who you are. When the inner narrator becomes critical, anxious, or repetitive, you can view it with the same detachment you might feel toward a radio that has been left on in the background. You are not the static on the radio. You are the space in which the sound occurs. This shift in perspective allows for a kind of psychological distance. You can observe a thought without becoming the thought. You can hear the narration without believing the story. This realization is the antidote to the suffering caused by identifying too closely to the chatter. We often spend our lives defending this constructed self, protecting the story our inner voice tells us, and feeling threatened when that story is challenged.
But if the self is a flowing river rather than a rock, there is nothing to defend. The voice insists that it is essential, that without its constant commentary, you would cease to navigate the world effectively. Yet when we examine the moments where the voice falls away, in states of deep flow, awe, or sudden surprise, we find that awareness does not disappear. It becomes clearer. This brings us to the quiet power that lies on the other side of the noise, where we discover that silence is not merely an absence, but a presence in its own right. When we manage to access that silence, even briefly, we realize that the quiet is not merely a lack of noise, but a physiological balm for a weary system. This presence creates a profound shift in how our brains consume energy. It is a well-known biological fact that the brain, despite representing only a small fraction of our total body weight, consumes roughly 20% of our metabolic energy, and a significant portion of that fuel is burned by the constant, self-referential processing of the default mode network. When the inner voice chatters incessantly, rehashing old arguments or anxious about future scenarios, it is biologically expensive. It keeps the nervous system in a state of low-grade vigilance, triggering subtle, continuous releases of stress hormones like cortisol that tell the body it is not quite safe. Stepping into silence signals the opposite. It tells the deep brain that the immediate environment is secure, allowing the parasympathetic nervous system, our rest and digest mode, to finally take the helm. Psychologists have identified a specific mechanism for this relief, known as attention restoration theory. The theory suggests that the focused, laser-like attention we use to solve problems, read emails, and navigate traffic is a finite resource that depletes rapidly throughout the day. When it runs low, we feel irritable, distracted, and mentally foggy. To recharge this specific type of attention, we do not need sleep alone. We need what researchers call soft fascination. This is the state of mind induced by watching clouds drift slowly across a blue sky, listening to the rhythmic crashing of ocean waves, or staring into the chaotic dance of a crackling fire. In these moments, the inner voice naturally lowers its volume because there is nothing to analyze, nothing to judge, and nothing to solve. The mind is engaged but not taxed, allowing the executive centers of the brain to recover, proving that silence is not just a spiritual luxury, but a cognitive necessity. This quieting effect is perhaps most potent during moments of awe, when we stand before a vast canyon, look up at the bright band of the Milky Way, or witness a stunning piece of art. Neuroimaging studies show that the default mode network drastically reduces its activity. Researchers call this the small self effect. In the face of something significantly greater than ourselves, the ego and the chatty narrator that sustains it temporarily recedes. Far from being frightening, this disappearance of the verbal self feels like a liberation. It's a moment of pure connection where the boundary between the observer and the world softens and the mental chatter is replaced by a vivid, silent awareness. It is in these silent gaps that creativity often finds its footing. We have all experienced the phenomenon of struggling with a difficult problem for hours, utilizing every ounce of logic, only to have the perfect solution appear suddenly and effortlessly while we are taking a shower, washing dishes, or walking the dog. This is not a coincidence. When the inner voice is dominant, it tends to restrict our thinking to logical, linear, and familiar paths. It is only when the voice falls silent during unfocused time that the brain's disparate networks can communicate freely, linking old memories with new ideas to form sudden insights. Silence, therefore, is not empty space. It is the fertile ground where our deepest intelligence grows, waiting for the noise to subside so it can be heard. Understanding this dynamic changes our relationship with the voice in our heads, allowing us to view the chatter not as an enemy, but simply as a habit that can be gently set aside. Recognizing this habit helps us appreciate the remarkable trajectory that brought us here, a developmental arc that spans from the nursery to the complexities of adult life. We began our lives as broadcast towers, narrating every movement and desire to anyone who would listen, unaware of the boundary between public speech and private thought. Over time, that external narration folded inward, traveling along the arcuate fasciculus to become the silent stream of consciousness that defines our waking hours. This migration from the outside world to the inner sanctum is not just a biological curiosity, it is the formation of the self. The voice evolved from a simple mechanism for controlling motor tasks, telling our hands which block to stack next, into a sophisticated simulator capable of time travel. It is this simulator that allows us to visit the past, extracting lessons from memories that would otherwise fade, and to project ourselves into the future, rehearsing conversations that haven't happened yet. In this way, the inner voice is the ultimate survival tool, a dedicated companion that runs endless scenarios to ensure we are prepared for the unpredictable nature of reality.
It transforms the brain from a simple reactive engine into a predictive machine, constantly updating its models of the world based on the whispers we hear in the silence of our own minds.
Yet, as we have explored, this companion is not always a perfect guide. It can become stuck in loops of rumination, replaying old failures with high-fidelity sound, or projecting anxieties onto a blank future. The power lies in the realization that we are the ones listening. We possess the capacity for self-distancing, the ability to step back and observe the chatter with the detachment of a scientist watching a storm on a radar screen. By using our own names or referring to ourselves in the third person, we can engage the brain's emotional regulation centers, turning a panic response into a problem-solving session. This delicate balance, honoring the voice for its utility while gently correcting its excesses, is the art of living with a mind. Even with all we know about the default mode network and the neurological pathways of speech, a profound mystery remains at the center of this experience. Science can map the blood flow and identify the neurons that fire when we talk to ourselves, but it cannot fully explain the texture of the experience itself, the undeniable feeling that there is a speaker and a listener sharing the same space. This internal dialogue is the user interface of consciousness, the familiar hum that accompanies us through every triumph and every sorrow. As we begin to wind down and let the analyzing mind rest, we can look upon this complex, chattering, predicting, worrying, and hoping mechanism with a sense of gratitude. It is, after all, the storyteller that stitches the scattered moments of our lives into a cohesive narrative, allowing us to say with certainty, "I am here." And yet, simply knowing you are here is perhaps the greatest feat this inner narrator accomplishes. It transforms the raw data of existence, the temperature of the room, the rhythm of your breathing, the fading memories of the day, into a story that belongs specifically to you. There is a profound comfort in realizing that this internal monologue, for all its occasional unruliness or repetitive loops, is fundamentally on your side. It is the architect of your identity, constantly building, renovating, and repairing the structure of who you believe yourself to be. Throughout history, philosophers and mystics have argued over where the soul resides, but perhaps we experience the closest thing to it in that private, silent space where words form without sound. It is a sanctuary that no one else can enter, a private library containing every thought, fear, wish, and dream you have ever held, cataloged by the faithful librarian of your consciousness. As the day winds down and the external stimulation of the world fades into the shadows, this inner voice shifts its cadence. The urgent instructions of the morning and the analytical problem-solving of the afternoon begin to lose their momentum, giving way to something softer and more reflective. It is during these quiet hours that the inner voice reveals its true nature as a lifelong companion. You are never truly alone, for there is always this witness, this gentle observer narrating the experience of being alive. It is worth considering how many millions of words have passed through your mind over the years, a vast, invisible river of language that has carved out the unique canyons of your personality. Tonight, as the house settles and the noise of society vanishes, you have the opportunity to make peace with this narrator. Instead of viewing it as a distraction keeping you from rest, you might view it as a storyteller finishing the final chapter of the day's book, preparing to close the cover so the author can rest. There is a unique power in deliberately choosing the final words you speak to yourself before sleep takes over.
Just as a parent reads a calming story to a child to banish the monsters of the dark, you possess the authority to direct your inner voice towards thoughts of safety, gratitude, or simple, peaceful nothingness. If the mind wanders to the worries of tomorrow, you can gently guide it back, using that inner voice to reassure itself that all is well and that nothing more needs to be solved tonight. This capability to self-soothe, to use language not for communication with others, but for the emotional regulation of the self, is one of the most advanced and beautiful functions of the human brain. It is the ultimate act of self-care, a lullaby sung by the self to the self, echoing in the quiet chamber of the mind. As we approach the end of this journey through the landscape of the mind, it is my hope that understanding the mechanics of your inner speech brings you a deep sense of ease. If you have found comfort in this quiet exploration of the mind's hidden conversations, and if you wish to continue discovering the wonders of the world and yourself in these late hours, I invite you to subscribe, ensuring that our paths cross again for the next story. But for now, the time for learning is fading, and the time for resting has arrived. The words in your mind are slowing down, the sentences becoming shorter, the pauses growing longer and more profound. There is a beauty in the silence that waits between the thoughts, a vast, peaceful ocean where the voice finally stops speaking and simply begins to float. The final, most amazing fact about the inner voice is that it eventually leads us to the place where language is no longer needed. It whispers its last observation, acknowledges the heavy warmth of sleep, and then, respectfully, it quiets down, leaving you in the perfect, restful silence of your own being.